You're listening to the Talking Headways Podcast Network. This is Talking Headways, a weekly podcast about sustainable transportation and urban design. I'm Jeff Wood. This week, we're joined by Hamilton Steimer of the World Resources Institute to talk about their report, Zero-emission Delivery Zones, a new way to cut traffic, air pollution, and greenhouse gases. Stay with us. Today's podcast is brought to you by our wonderful Patreon supporters, past, present, and future. We really can't thank you all enough for the support, whether you've supported for a month or over 5 years. Join this merry band of infrastructure nerds and zoning wizards and support Talking Headways and Mondays at the Overhead Wire. $2 a month gets you stickers, including our Cars Are Cholesterol sticker and a handwritten note. $10 a month gets you one of our transportation scarves. Thanks everyone from the advocates to the bus drivers that support this show. Go to patreon.com/theoverheadwire to support. That's patreon.com/theoverheadwire. You can also get our transportation scarves, sign up for our daily newsletter started in 2006, or get our audiobook version of Raymond Unwin's Town Planning and Practice by going to theoverheadwire.com. Also, in the show notes, you'll find links to the bookshop.org affiliate store and link to purchase some of our Cars Are Cholesterol merch, designed with the great help of Richard Wazensky. Follow him on Instagram at DickDavidSketches if you get a chance. Thanks for all your support, and we look forward to sharing with you what's next. Well, Hamilton Steimer, welcome to the Talking Headways podcast.
Thank you very much for having me. I really appreciate it, Jeff.
Well, thanks for being on the show. Before we get started, can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
I'm a research analyst at the World Resources Institute. This is a nonprofit think tank based out of Washington, D.C. We focus on a host of different environmental sustainability policy topics. I currently work with our electric school bus initiative. My team in particular, we're helping to try and accelerate the electric school bus adoption wave across the United States. But this paper that we're talking about is when I was working with our e-mobility team. That team's more focused kind of on e-mobility policy and topics generally.
And how did you get into this? How did you get into this topic? Was it something that you found when you were young that you were interested in transportation, urban policy, or was it something that kind of evolved later on in life?
Definitely something that evolved more later on in life. My graduate background was more in kind of the energy policy space, but I was really interested kind of in the EV space now that it's fully starting to develop and grow. It was kind of the intersection between transportation and energy. So working kind of with WRI, this was a research topic that was funded by the UPS Foundation. We don't do any work that's tailored to benefit UPS, but it's just more kind of freight topics generally. And this is something that's really developing in Europe and something that we thought could be interesting to talk about and study in the US context.
That's really interesting. I mean, I understand how funding works for a lot of different projects and stuff, but it feels like something that might, and we'll get to the topic in a second, but it feels like something that might push them to go in a direction that they might not be interested in, or they're tangentially interested in because somebody else is making them do it.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. I can't speak too much about what their inclination is, but I know there's a lot of interest kind of in the freight sector right now about, there's obviously a lot of policy push and a lot of policy pressure to kind of push towards more sustainable, environmentally friendly fuel sources and transportation modes. So kind of what our research kind of focuses on is what some options are, obviously what are best practices that are underway. And we kind of focused on a US policy context.
And also for the folks who might not know, what is the World Resources Institute specifically? And then also what kind of stuff do you work on generally?
So we are a large environmental nonprofit think tank based out of Washington, D.C. International focus, offices located in the U.S., Mexico, Brazil office, England. It's all over the world. We have over 1,000 employees total. We focus on, like I said, a host of different topics ranging from, e-mobility within the city space. This could be clean energy, could be food systems, could be related to maritime focus. So a broad focus. We do a lot of research kind of in the policy advocacy space.
Well, so you all released a working paper last fall, Zero-emission Delivery Zones, Decarbonizing Urban Freight and Goods Delivery in U.S. Cities. So why is freight and urban freight specifically such an important topic at the moment?
So I think maybe the public is mostly thinking about kind of the light duty vehicle, but a lot of policy attention right now is kind of on that medium heavy duty freight sector. Part of the reason is historically that sector's contributed a lot to air pollution, especially within urban and cities and within underserved communities. So there's been a lot of attention on kind of our air pollution. How can we go about reducing its contribution to that? And also part of the reason why this sector is getting a lot of attention kind of as we go about decarbonizing the transportation sector has been, you have a lot of fleets that are, it's seen as a much more manageable sector to kind of take a first stab in. Even though the technology itself is maybe less developed than light duty vehicles, From a policy implementation standpoint, it's a little bit easier to talk to a bunch of your fleet owners and go about implementing a policy that will affect them versus the general public. So it's seen as something that's more manageable, kind of as like a take them on first and then kind of expand to policies that impact the larger public.
And the difference between, say, light duty and medium duty is basically cars and trucks that people buy to move themselves around versus delivery vehicles, UPS trucks, those types of things.
Yeah, exactly. So, for example, you could see deliveries done on, sometimes you may see like your Uber deliveries on like a regular car, or you may have someone kind of moving on like a moped or something. So that kind of falls into your light duty category, but your larger duty, as you mentioned, is going to be more of your commercial fleets, something that you see kind of, as you mentioned, like the UPS or even like your tractor trailers as well. Those kind of fall into your medium to heavy duty side, but mostly based on kind of like the weight of the vehicle.
And what are some of the impacts of these urban deliveries? What are some of the things that, cities are seeing as major impacts that they want to solve for?
Sure. As I mentioned, the medium heavy duty market has received a lot of policy attention over the years. But I think, especially kind of during the start of the COVID pandemic, you saw a spike in delivery services as everyone had to go and purchase a lot of their goods online. So I think for the general public, there was maybe kind of a peak of their interest, and they seemed to more notice kind of the increased delivery activity. And as I mentioned, this kind of coincided with, a growth in kind of the EV sector itself generally. So there's been a lot of push from policymakers in the cities, as well as I think within the federal and national level, to think of different solutions to help decarbonize the sector.
How fast are these companies and, small fleets moving that direction? Is it something that's coming quite quickly, or is it something that's taking a little longer than maybe expected?
That's a good question. I'm not an expert really on kind of the pace of the electrification of the freight sector. So I would say it's happening slower than I think we need. Like for example, Amazon, I think has committed by a couple tens of thousands, 100,000 or so plus zero emission delivery vehicles. I think from Rivian, USPS obviously is making strides in trying to gain EV postal delivery vehicles. But from our conversations with fleets, is it's kind of been a bit of a slower process. A lot of this is kind of related to the COVID pandemic, just as supply chains obviously have slowed, prices have gone up. It's a very expensive transition. There's a lot of moving components that they have to consider. So it's something that policymakers, I think, who are prioritizing those climate reductions goals, I think there's some concern. So trying to think of ways to kind of help businesses make that transition and also kind of increase the pressure on them to accelerate that transition.
So a potential solution to some of the issues that we're seeing and maybe to speed up some of this electrification of fleets, or at least in certain areas, is the zero emission delivery zone. So what specifically is a zero emission delivery zone as it's defined?
Sure. I may have to give a little bit of background context before getting into the definition.
Sure.
So if you look across, you have a Europe-based audience or not, but if you go to Europe, you may hear low emission zones. That's something that's much more familiar, especially within Europe. These are designated areas within cities, typically at the city center, where vehicles have to meet certain emissions requirements in order to enter, or they may have to pay a fee or something like that. So zero emission zones are kind of seen as the next step, where now to enter the area, you have to have a zero emission vehicle. Zero emission delivery zones are a subset of zero emission zones. As I mentioned, with the sector being seen as something that's a little more manageable from a policy perspective, they're kind of focusing on, how can we just tailor it towards delivery vehicles. So kind of the way we define a zero emission delivery zone is like a designated area targeting delivery vehicles in which to have unlimited road access. You need to be a zero emission vehicle.
From a policy perspective, why would you want to focus on deliveries only and not just make it a low traffic zone or whatever the definition that anybody's using these days for congestion pricing or
Sure.
cordons or whatever it is? Why wouldn't you just make it blanket rather than just freight?
So, a lot of the early development regarding this policy is in Europe, as I mentioned, particularly within the Netherlands. In 2019, their national climate plan, I think they require between 30 and 40 cities to implement zero emission zones by 2030. And so a lot of these cities, obviously those zero emission zones that will be implemented will cover all types of road traffic. But right now, as they kind of take those initial steps, they're thinking, EVs are still very expensive. We don't necessarily have the infrastructure for everyone to transition. What is a more manageable market aspect that we can target? And for them, they're targeting this delivery freight sector, which, historically they've targeted with their low emission zones, a lot of policy work targeting the freight sector historically. So for them, it's a more manageable, it's not easy, it's more manageable kind of first step to target them, see how it goes, start developing the infrastructure, start to understand what are the pros and cons of the policy itself before then later ramping it up to the larger vehicle market.
So then what do these look like? What would a zone look like in terms of, the map that you see on a Google map or whatever, or, an implementation? How would it be implemented?
So what we talk about in the paper is they actually can look many different ways. I think maybe the most widely well known is kind of what a low emission zone looks like, or if you're familiar with the ultra low emission zone in London, you may have a sign that tells you you're going into a low emission zone. There could be an access point that you have to pass through with maybe like a toll, or there may just be an area that has cameras that are then tracking your license plate to see what's the emissions rating for the vehicle that they're taking the picture of. So that could be a larger area. Traditionally at the city center has kind of been a lot of the focus. What we talk about in the paper is there's other alternatives to just this kind of city-centric policy. And I think it doesn't have to be even the large city center, it can be even smaller. So we talk about in the paper, for example, Los Angeles is implementing a more distributed, smaller, more tailored policy called Zero-emission Commercial Loading Zones. What that is basically reserving a loading zone within a heavy commercial district for only zero-emission delivery vehicles. And the reason why they're doing that is they recognize that curb space, especially within a heavily trafficked urban environment, is of value to your delivery businesses. So by reserving it for a zero-emission delivery vehicle, you create that incentive for a transporter or carrier to maybe use a zero-emission delivery vehicle on that route to have access to that. And so basically what you could do is you could eventually implement a few of those. You're not really disrupting the local transport market. You're not infringing on people's ability to get anywhere. But then you can then scale the policy up and then create what we call like a de facto ZEDZ, where if you wanted to, you could just have basically every parking spot or every loading zone can become a zero-emission commercial loading zone or zero-emission parking space, which would then create, in essence, a zero-emission delivery zone.
Are we going to see this also, I guess at the time when electric vehicles become ubiquitous, which is, I am guessing, in the next 30 years, I who knows what that timeline that actually is going to fall upon. But then what happens to something that's focused on zero emissions? Is it just become regular like curb management, or does it become a regular cordon? Or I'm just wondering what like the implementation of the policy might lead to in the future once you get to the policy goal, which you've reached with the zero emissions tagline.
That's a good question. It's something I've not really thought of before. If I had to guess,
I love wild speculation too. So
yeah, my guess is, first up, for example, using LA as an example, they've only done 5 of these zero-emission commercial loading zones. So it's a very small scale policy. It's very much kind of in that pilot, let's see kind of what happens phase. Hopefully, if successful, they plan to, I think, maybe expand to 100. Potentially, as I said, they could just expand to all over the city. It's related to, they have a bunch of plans that kind of implement, they're prioritizing decarbonizing transportation sector. That's partially related to them. They have the 2028 Olympics, and they're trying to do some work in that area by that point. So, my guess is, eventually, if this kind of becomes the standard, EVs become the standard, you may no longer need to have something that's explicitly like reserve space for zero commercial loading zone or zero commercial vehicle or something like that. It'll just become everyone's using EVs, everyone's switched over, have transitioned away from, a lot of these states are implementing bans on new internal combustion engine vehicle sales by 2035 in some places. So I would assume in those markets, maybe right now you would have these more tailored policies that are targeting these vehicles, but eventually they probably would I'm assuming would go away once the whole market space has been converted.
And what about vehicle sizes? I mean, in some cities, especially in places like the Netherlands, there's, narrow streets and it's hard to get through for larger vehicles. And so maybe they, get to a micro hub or whatever, and they give it off to an e-cargo bike or some other delivery system. I'm interested in that too, in terms of the vehicle sizes, like what this policy, a emissions ZZ, as it would say,
Yeah.
what that would mean for converting to smaller vehicles or more pedestrianized spaces or areas that aren't going to allow cars. There's low traffic neighborhoods and then there's car free zones, especially in places like Europe. So
Yeah.
I'm curious what that might look like as well.
And that's an excellent point. And it's actually what we're seeing in Europe right now. So we spoke with some policymakers in Rotterdam and Amsterdam as well. And as you mentioned, kind of in their historic city centers, those are very old cities. They weren't built around cars like our cities were. They have much more smaller streets. So they are using kind of those zero emission cargo bikes or like minibuses to help with local deliveries. As you mentioned, they may have a consolidation center or something located outside the zone that maybe is using a regular diesel truck. And then they have goods moved onto these smaller vehicles to go into the city center for deliveries. So that's something I think could potentially happen in the US. And the US is a little weird just in the sense that, a lot of our cities are built around cars. So we kind of have, it's easier for these larger delivery vehicles to have access to areas throughout our cities. So I hope that we see more use of e-cargo bikes in these other smaller delivery vehicles, just because I think they're safer. I think they're just a more economical transport mode currently, but it may just depend on kind of what policy priorities city policymakers have.
From a commercial perspective, I'm wondering also what companies or what stores or shops or who benefits the most from these types of implementations. What happens to smaller stores or smaller delivery companies or those types of things? So I'm curious about the impacts too.
That's a great question. And one of the things about our paper that we thought was unique is we kind of have a real emphasis on equity, asking kind of people who are implementing or considering these policies, how are you considering equity? Obviously, first off, from a underserved community standpoint, a lot of these communities are centered around distribution centers. There's a lot, or near major transportation hubs, so they get exposed to a lot of the air pollution. But also from an economic standpoint, there's a lot of small businesses who may be freight dependent, who might be unable to afford transitioning their fleet at the moment just due to the high cost that it would demand. How are these policies kind of considering their needs as well? And so, I think what I find interesting is, like, for example, using, again, LA's policy tool, kind of having that smaller scale kind of allows you to tailor the impacts of your policy more specifically. So if you were to have a larger zone policy, it may be harder to mitigate some of these unintended consequences, but having a more tailored policy that's maybe more specific to, in this instance, the commercial loading zone, you're able to kind of control who's actually being influenced by it. And a lot of these policymakers that we talked with, they are going about it differently, how they're considering equity, but all of them are considering equity. They are thinking about, the impacts economically and socially and environmentally on the communities that they're serving. They're usually talking to residents as well as small businesses about implementing these policies to see if they want to participate. Another example is Santa Monica, which has maybe I think probably I would say the first traditional concept of a ZZ in the US. This is a pilot program. I believe it ended at the end of last year. I was actually just in contact with the city recently, and they said that their final report on that is coming out sometime soon. So I think maybe next month they mentioned. That was a volunteer ZZ. So, I think it was the size of the area, but it was focused within their downtown area up against the beach. That was volunteer in the sense that, they tried to encourage people to participate in the ZZ, but they didn't mandate it. So there may be some concerns about, how does that limit the effectiveness of the zone? But it also, though, in another sense, it's not putting too much of an undue burden on local businesses, so they're not being forced to convert. So you're having to kind of balance that effectiveness demand as well as kind of that equity priority.
Since the report came out, have you gotten a lot of interest from cities thinking about doing these commercial ZZs, or has it been something where they've focused on other things, other implementations of downtown kind of restrictions or urban area restrictions?
We have gotten a lot of attention from this paper. With it just coming out in November, I think there's still some time to see if other cities are interested in wanting to pursue it further. I think right now, at least as far as I'm aware, it's a lot of the same people we had talked with for this paper. So, for example, we had talked with LA, obviously, we had talked with Santa Monica. Seattle is actually another city that's heavily considering this policy tool. They are part of a C40 Cities pledge. I think it's called Green and Healthy Streets Declaration, where they basically have committed to implementing a zero emission area in their city by 2030. They have a report analyzing, potential areas for a ZEDZ, and they were looking at an area called the Duwamish Valley, which is historically a heavily polluted, a very diverse community. A lot of distribution centers are around there. And I actually just saw, I actually pulled it up before this call. I just realized they released a report earlier this month, a study recommendations report, where they're also looking at zero emission commercial loading zones and also smaller neighborhood zero emission delivery hubs. So I think there's a lot of cities that are interested in this. Hopefully they're using our working paper as a resource. But I'm hoping to see more interest kind of over the coming years. I think it's something that, cities need to be thinking about and probably are.
You mentioned talking to a lot of experts in the US and around the world about this specific topic. I'm wondering if there's anything that stood out to you about your conversations with them, or is there anything that surprised you about some of your conversations with them?
Ooh, that's a good question. I think one of them I would say is it's a very tricky policy to implement just due to some of the requirements that freight businesses operate under. So for example, a lot of the freight traffic that may be regulated based off of like times they're allowed to drive into the city for deliveries. Businesses kind of govern a lot of the delivery times. They don't just come whenever, they come when the business wants them to come. So you have to think about those kinds of considerations. So at least from my perspective, was kind of learning a little bit more of kind of some of the restrictions that carriers are operating under. Policymakers have to consider that when they're thinking of this type of policy, what scale to implement it, and how to mitigate those unintended consequences. And I think also, when we started this paper, we were really planning on focusing on something that what Santa Monica is doing, which is more that traditional zero emission delivery zone that's kind of reflective of the low emission zones you see in Europe. But as we were talking to, LA, talking to Seattle, talking to other people, we started kind of understanding that, hey, maybe we need to expand kind of our understanding of what a zero emission delivery zone could look like. It could be the smaller, more tailored policy that could then build up to something that's larger and more, affects more of the transport system citywide. So I think that also was another interesting finding.
Something interesting from the report that stood out to me specifically was the companies that tried to evade the low emission zones. And the example I think that was most prominent was in, I think it was London, where large companies have large fleets of vehicles. And so if somebody implements a zone, the fleet location just changes. They move an electric truck from some other city to the place. And so the actual emissions don't go down. They just go down in that one area. And I thought that was fascinating as well.
That's a great point. In the at the end of our paper, we kind of conclude with a couple of recommendations for policymakers to consider to implement these ZZs effectively and equitably. One of the recommendations we have is to consider state policy reform. This is a particular challenge, I think, that's going to be within the U.S. So kind of going back to the Netherlands example that I mentioned earlier, the ZZ policy, I think Rotterdam is kind of one of the first people to pursue ZZs, that kind of policy. But this policy was a federal, it's from their national government. It's something that the national government said that cities have to implement. Versus in the US, there's no national policy mandating that cities kind of pursue this type of policy. It's something that's simply happening on a city by city basis if they're interested. That's why we only see a handful of cities, and they're kind of traditionally the usual actors who, are pursuing some of the most progressive policies out there, LA and Seattle and others. And kind of as you mentioned in your question, some of the research out there regarding other types of policies like congestion charging, low emission zones have found that a national system is a little more effective with carriers and kind of producing, system-wide benefits. For example, if it was just a city implementing something, a carrier may just decide to move out its polluting vehicles to another city and put in its newest vehicles in the city with the policy to meet policy requirements. So for a ZZ to be really effective at actually influencing, new zero emission vehicle adoption, it's something that needs to be in multiple cities, hopefully something nationwide. I don't necessarily think that's going to happen. But you would need, I think, a lot of your major metro areas to start implementing similar types of policies. Otherwise, an Amazon or UPS or your other smaller carriers, they're not really going to actually go and be incentivized to adopt new vehicles because of this policy. They'll just go and move vehicles they already bought to the areas with the zero emission delivery zones, so their operations aren't impacted.
Can you tell us a little bit more about Rotterdam's implementation? I'm interested specifically in that one because it is the main game.
Sure. Yeah, they're a really interesting case because they've been implementing similar policies for a couple of years now. Rotterdam is really interesting where the city has a very close relationship with the business community. There's a huge port, pretty robust economy. So back in 2014, they started thinking about making the city center emission free. They actually went and implemented, I think, basically the first zero emission delivery zone along a street within the city. So they've been kind of at this for several years now. And they have a thing called the Covenant Zero Emission City Logistics, which is basically this formal relationship with the businesses in the city to kind of talk about, hey, we have this priority of, basically encouraging zero emission freight in the city. What are ways that we can work together between the city and the business community? What are ways we can work together to kind of go about accomplishing those goals while obviously maximizing economic benefits? And so, now obviously the country itself has kind of implemented some of the things that's gone on in Rotterdam, now making zero emission zones, national priority. But it's kind of interesting to see that a lot of that did start kind of in Rotterdam as kind of pioneers of this type of policy.
It's interesting because they've done a lot in all sectors, including purchasing and procurement and all those things. They have a lot of zero emissions policies for that too, which is really interesting. So I find Rotterdam is kind of ahead of the game when it comes to a number of those things.
For sure. And if you look up Covenant ZECL online, you can find some of the planning documents that they've released over the years. And, they don't see the zero emission delivery zone as being kind of the sole policy. There's a bunch of other supportive policies that they're implementing, such as consolidation centers, to really kind of go about making the zero emission delivery dream, a reality.
So what are some of the ways that cities can take the findings in your report and implement them? Or what are the ways that you think that people can learn from what you all have found?
Sure. The way the paper is set up is kind of talking somewhat generically about the different impacts related to freight, looking at comparable policies to see if there's any best practices that could be related to this policy, looking at current examples that are being implemented, such as in Rotterdam, LA, Seattle, and then kind of concluding with a bunch of different recommendations to policymakers. And so we kind of took away some of the best practices we saw from each case. So, for example, from the Rotterdam example, we thought, it was really unique that they really kind of stressed this mutually beneficial relationship with their community, their business community. It helps you kind of identify, who is going to be your champions that you can work with, maybe on pilots, and also may kind of identify, who are going to be the people that may kind of offer some resistance, but also kind of a way to understand, what are the concerns that are being offered. So that's one example. We talk about how this policy can be implemented at a more tailored, as we mentioned, a more distributed level. So I think for cities, obviously they need to go and look at their local markets. They need to think about, what are the local challenges? It's probably good, I would suggest, to sit down with a bunch of your local carriers to kind of hear, maybe start thinking through what are your policy goals, sharing that with your carriers and try and see if there are maybe some synergies you can think about, and just think about what are ways to, obviously I think, at least in my opinion, the priority needs to be thinking about advancing this market, reducing transport freight emissions. So obviously I think, you need to do a policy that's going to actually produce those benefits and quickly. But I think it's important to think about what are ways to do it creatively that won't put an undue burden on local businesses as well as communities who have been underserved historically.
Well, I hope folks go and check out the paper. Where can folks find it if they want to read it and download it and get a copy?
You can find it easily online. I would just Google WRIZZ, and you should find several links that pop up. There's not a lot out there currently in the US, so I think you should be easily able to find this report. You may find that we've done kind of an article related to this release that's a little more of a summary, as well as the working paper itself, which is more in depth.
And the paper, I believe, is about 28 pages long, so it's not like it's 200 pages or anything along those lines. So
yeah, not too long. Hopefully you can find a section that looks relevant to you and be able to quickly read through it. One of the things we prioritize when making the paper is trying to make it accessible as possible for policymakers as well as lay people.
Lots of good information in there. Well, awesome. Well, Hamilton, thanks so much for joining us. We really appreciate your time.
Thank you very much for having me. I really appreciate it.
And thanks for joining us. The Talking Headways podcast is a project of The Overhead Wire and published first at Streetsblog USA. Thanks to our wonderful Patreon supporters for sponsoring this week's show and Mondays at The Overhead Wire. Find us at patreon.com/theoverheadwire. And you can sign up for our 16-year-old newsletter at theoverheadwire.com. And you can also listen to our show on your podcatcher of choice, including Spotify, Stitcher, SoundCloud, iHeartRadio, and Apple Podcasts. And if you can't find it there, you can always find its original home at usa.streetsblog.org. We'll see you next time at Talking Headways.